The 2023 general elections date has finally been set by President Emmerson Mnangagwa in a gazette published today, the 31st of May 2023. And President Emmerson Mnangagwa has set the 23rd of August 2023 as the date for the general elections to be held. Hello and welcome to this special current affairs program where we are analyzing the implications of the proclamation of that date by President Emmerson Mnangagwa. I'm Justin Matlatla. Of course, prior to this proclamation, it's been all about the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, talking about registration of voters, talking about the delimitation report, the inspection of the voters' roll, as well as other processes associated with the preparations for the elections. And today, finally, the proclamation made by President Emmerson Mnangagwa setting the 23rd of August 2023 as the date for the holding of the general elections. Now, to discuss further the implications of the dictates of this proclamation that has just been made by President Emmerson Mnangagwa, I'm joined in the studio by Dr. Prolific Mataruse, who is a political analyst. Dr. Mataruse, welcome to the program.
Oh, thank you, Justin.
I'm also joined by Advocate Louis Uriri, who is a legal expert, to look further into these issues. Advocate, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
As well as another legal expert, that's Joe Signoro. Joe, it's a pleasure having you.
Thank you. It's an absolute pleasure to be here.
I'll start with Dr. Mataruse. The proclamation made today by President Emmerson Mnangagwa setting the 23rd of August 2023 as the general elections date. What does it mean to the general public?
Thank you. So it means that we're now in an election period. So someone might think that, okay, we've been talking about elections for the past year or so. There's been an election frenzy in the country. But legally, I think the experts will talk about what it really means. But from a political standpoint, an election day is important to the election experience as envisaged by the Constitution of Zimbabwe, but also by the general spirit of the ethos of our democracy, our budding democracy as a country. It is about people expressing their right to vote, which is a right enshrined as well in the Constitution of Zimbabwe, where people have to get a chance, to select their representatives. It's a rare opportunity in a country where people have a say in how they are governed. And that brings also the bigger discussion about the whole meaning of elections in a country in terms of their meaning, for political power, legitimizing political power, their potential for transformation in society, and their importance as well for stabilizing a society, because it gives a chance for political temperatures to be fermented, and vented as well.
Wow, okay, fermented and vented. Perhaps we'll discuss further into the issue of political temperatures, Doctor. But then, Advocate Uriri, the people of Zimbabwe will soon be exercising their constitutional right to vote. But the president has just also exercised his constitutional mandate by making that proclamation. Take us further into the constitutionality of that proclamation.
Well, the proclamation is at the center of the election period. As the good doc mentioned, legally, we are now in the election period. And the timelines for the holding of the election and what happens hereafter is determined by the proclamation. Thus, for instance, the voters' roll will close 2 days after today. Nomination of candidates is determined by reference to the date of proclamation.
Okay.
The date of the elections themselves is set in the proclamation. As far as the presidential election is concerned, in the event of a runoff, the date is fixed in the proclamation. The places where the nomination court will sit are all fixed in the proclamation. And so everything begins to run from the date of the proclamation.
So that's the legality of that proclamation. Now to you, Joe, what is the importance of such kind of a proclamation to any election?
Thank you. The proclamation sets in motion a series of events which make up the electoral process. As mentioned by the learned advocate here, it is from the proclamation date that we can tell when the nomination court will sit, for instance. Yes.
Want
that
to
justice
add?
here to be made to set in process the other motions. No, it's a constitutional requirement that such a proclamation be made. So we had no option. Otherwise, we would have a constitutional crisis in the country.
Oh, I think that's very important as well. We have dates that pertain to, is it section 158 of the Constitution that talks about this, the expiry of the lifespan of Parliament?
It is a mandatory requirement of the law, and it has to take place within very carefully defined time frames, which are defined by the Constitution itself. For instance, the life of Parliament, all things being equal, lasts for 5 years, reckoned from the date that the President-elect took oath of office.
Okay.
And His Excellency, then President-elect, took oath of office on the 26th August 2018. And so the 5-year period is reckoned from that date. And if the election is to be held not less than 30 days from the time that the life of Parliament, not more than 30 days from the time the life of Parliament is due to run out, it means that proclamation must take place within a certain period, and the election itself must be held before a particular time. So it is mandatory, and the whole constitutional framework demands that it be held within carefully defined timeframes. Otherwise, as Doc has said, we will have a constitutional crisis.
Well, I believe that has just been averted, and the proclamation has just been done according to the Constitution. Now, let's look at the political environment under which this proclamation has been made. What is your assessment of the prevailing political situation or the environment in the country?
Oh, thank you. So the country has been polarized for some time, and you find there's been many attempts to heal and reach out across the political divide. So this is a major facet of this environment that still prevails right now. And hopefully we hope, something doesn't degenerate, this temperature doesn't go further. But I think something that might continue to cause commotion is the discussion on the Electoral Amendment Bill, which was still pending. So you might find there could be a lot of discussion around that, and there is also a lot of talk about reforms. How that discussion of reforms is going to be factored into this period, I think, is very important.
The issue of the Electoral Amendment Bill that is being debated, does it affect, or is it affected by this proclamation in any way?
Well, people can continue to debate that. Parliament might even continue with the process until it stands dissolved. But legally, any changes to the electoral law after the proclamation of the dates does not affect the election. So the election will be held in accordance with the law as it stood today.
I see.
Yes.
Okay. And now to you, Joe. What legal procedures now should be followed, particularly by the leaders of political parties, now that we have the election date set? What legal procedures should they be following until voting date?
Thank you. The next step from now would be the nomination of candidates. Political parties and aspiring candidates have to prepare to go through the nomination court. Upon going to the nomination court, they will be officially deemed to be candidates. As of now, we only have prospective and aspiring candidates. So that is the next essential step for any aspiring candidates.
And I believe maybe for the sake of our audiences, you can expound further. What does the nomination court entail? What exactly happens at that court? What kind of a court is it? What does the nomination court really do? Who goes to the nomination court and on what grounds?
Okay. I would define the nomination court as a tribunal which is tasked to examine qualifications of prospective candidates. That is the main agenda of the nomination court. It is presided over by a nomination officer who goes through nomination forms or nomination papers or maybe we can describe it as an application of a prospective candidate, to see whether that candidate has the requisite qualifications to participate in the seat or office they intend to run for.
Okay, and every member of a political party who wishes to participate in the election should go through the nomination court.
Indeed, indeed.
We'll take a break on that note. Join us after these messages. Welcome back. We are continuing with our discussion that follows the proclamation made by President Emmerson Mnangagwa through a gazette today, the 31st of May 2023, in which he announced that general elections for the year 2023 will be held on the 23rd of August 2023. And as we have our legal experts as well as our political analysts here in the studio taking a look at what that proclamation implies. And now, advocates, I want you to look at whether we have any circumstances under which anyone may be disqualified from the nomination court.
Yes, there are several. Obviously, one of the qualifications is that you must be a registered voter in that constituency. You must be technically resident in that constituency.
Okay.
There are instances where somebody has been convicted of a scheduled offense. And sentenced to specified parameters, then you may not participate in the election.
In the election,
yeah.
Okay, and that is clearly spelled out in our Constitution or in the Electoral Act?
Clearly spelled out in the Constitution, clearly spelled out in the electoral law.
We know, as you mentioned earlier, that there are issues sometimes of members who ignite violence or who promote violence and so forth. But from your assessment, can we really say now the election period has started and the campaign period has officially begun?
Yes, it should mean that for political parties, you know, any political party that is serious of attaining any position should make sure that it has its people reporting to the nomination court. It has its people also setting up campaigns. It means putting up of posters. You know, so for anyone that's really serious about winning this election, whether at local government level, at constitution, at parliamentary level, that's at the constitution's one, or at the president's level, they have to take this as a cue that they have to up their game. But I think upping your game does not mean violence. You know, it should not mean violence. We have had a culture and an experience in the past where elections in Africa, and including in this country, have been marred by violence. But I think it's, it's something that we must grow out of as a country. Currently, there's been a lot of heated exchange. Yes, heated exchanges and confrontations, as long as they are debate, they are welcome and they're healthy to a democracy. But that should not degenerate into physical violence.
So does the current atmosphere allow for free and fair elections, in your opinion?
There's been a lot that has been done to try to have free and fair, elections. And that's a question which, really, depending on who you ask, you might get various views. But I think there's been a lot that has been done, and we have to commend that. And there is a lot that can also still be done. Democracies tend to evolve. I was looking at the American Constitution, the American proclamation. It's only much later that they made fundamental changes to how an election is proclaimed. It was the same situation with the UK, situation in South Africa. So we are moving and we're slowly getting there. But what I think is important to highlight is that violence of any kind, especially from political differences, is immature and is anti people. It's anti the spirit of the liberation struggles that we fought for this country. What we need to see is a healthy contestation of Zimbabweans and ideas, people battling it out over ideas and not throwing stones at each other. Yeah.
Advocate, I want you perhaps to take us into whether you think Zimbabwe has made enough legal provisions to allow for free and fair elections.
Yes, I do think that we have got adequate provisions to allow for the holding of free and fair elections. The primary document is the supreme law of the Republic of Zimbabwe. And the supreme law of the Republic of Zimbabwe is the Constitution itself. And remember that the Constitution is a contract amongst the people of Zimbabwe on how they ought to be governed. And you recall the constitutional referendum.
Yeah.
And I do expect that all of us knew what we were voting for when we voted for this specific constitution. But you also want to look at the constitution's compliance with international standards or norms. How do we comply with the SADC principles? How do we comply with the AU principles? How do we measure up to international standards? I think we adequately measure up in terms of the protection of the right to participate in the election, in terms of provision of equal media coverage to all persons involved. And we actually have got the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission with a constitutional mandate to supervise actually how the publicity is being undertaken. You have statutory provisions relating to how the election itself is to be done, how nomination happens, how you can be disqualified, how you can object to a nomination, and at every stage there is judicial oversight. And you then go to, by judicial oversight, I simply mean that if somebody is unhappy, one can actually take that unhappiness to court. And a judge decides upon that unhappiness. You have got the whole nomination procedure in the electoral law. You have got what can be done, what cannot be done, prohibited symbols, and things like that. And so the law itself is very clear and conforms substantially to international norms and standards. Of course, society is always evolving, and there may be other things that can be done better, that can be improved upon, which is why we have got the engagement of the Electoral Law Amendment Bill. That should be a continual process.
I'm happy. Yes, you want to add to that, Joe?
Advocate has just said. The law has also safeguarded free and fair elections by imposing criminal liability on any malpractices or intimidation perpetrated by supporters or political parties. And most interestingly, the law has imposed liability on political parties and candidates for the conduct of their supporters, which means that if supporters go out of line, the political parties and the candidate can face the wrath of the law. So in that respect, I think the law has promoted free and fair elections.
Wow, okay. I think that also...
To add to that,
yes.
The electoral law actually provides for engagement between the Electoral Commission and political parties. So there will be regular meetings leading up to the election and in the post-election period between ZEC and the political parties. And it is in the interest of the political parties to ensure that ZEC knows how to contact them and that they attend these meetings as they review whatever is happening at every stage.
Okay, Joe. Yes, you want to add again?
I also just add, so free and fairness of something, of elections,
and credibility.
Definitely there are issues to do with objective measurements, which are described in the law. But on top of that, it's also a subjective issue, where it must be seen by everyone and it must be felt by everyone that this thing has been free, fair and credible.
But we know it's actually not possible for everyone to agree and say, perhaps the majority.
You know what? The point I'm making is that the onus then is upon ZEC and others to ensure that they make people feel, that they are delivering something that is free, something that is fair, and that is credible. That is something else. It's a big task, but it's what the Commission also has to do to make sure people feel that. So it's also a battle for the minds in the heart.
Well,
but just
I
to-
believe
to-
Zeki
to-
will
to
live up
add
to
that,
that. I believe.
What determines freeness and fairness, I think, is how objectively viewed we measure up to the law, we measure up to international standards. And that is why you find that if there are certain malpractices, there might be a basis for setting aside.
What kind of issues perhaps can the public raise in terms of unhappiness during this electoral period?
Well, it depends at what stage. But by and large, malpractices might relate to prohibited symbols, violence, which might actually alter the way people express their constitutional right to vote, which is what Dr. Matarusi was talking about. That if, for instance, in my constituency, somebody's burned down in their house, what is that likely to say to other people in that constituency? Are they going to exercise that right freely? Are they going to exercise that right, or basically they are going to
Refrain.
either to refrain or to exercise it otherwise than they would have exercised it?
That's true.
Yes.
Okay, we'll take another break on that note. Join us when we return. We are talking about what the proclamation of the 23rd of August 2023 as the election date for the general elections that's been set by President Emmerson Mnangagwa implies. Discussing the implications of the proclamation by President Emmerson Mnangagwa of the 23rd of August 2023 as the date for the general elections. Dr. Mataruse, in every election we have election observers. We also have somewhat the involvement of civil society organizations. Can you maybe expound on the role of election observers in this election and that of the civil society organizations, and what are their limitations?
Okay, so the president of the country, he has invited election observers to come in line with the constitution as well. So the observers and civil society organizations, we have many in the country, some of them concerned with elections, like the Zimbabwe Election Support Network, ZESNI. They have a duty now to make sure that, for checks and balances, they be on guard. Observing an election is a tedious and expensive job. Citizens can't do that. And it's also a technical job in terms of the legalities and the processes that are involved. So they need to be able to do that on behalf of the people and also assist people in terms of voter education, explaining to people how it's supposed to happen. But I think for observers, Zimbabwe was one of the first countries in the world in 1980 to have election observers. So I think the important aspect for observers is to make sure that they are seen by the people and they are seen by the government, that they are there. And that is eventually when they pass on a verdict of whatsoever kind, whether they are SADC, they are AU, they are from the EU, from wherever they are, that people tend to believe that and are connected to whatsoever judgment they would have given. So they have an important job as far as people are concerned. You find, especially when debates after the election, every election has a debate after. Observer reports are very important in validating or invalidating some things that would have happened. So it's an important thing. We hope that the observers from various countries, various missions, international, can be able to take up on the call and can also be able to defend, both the legality of the processes and the wishes of of the people as well.
And in terms of their parameters, we have heard of some CSOs that get involved outside of their mandate in terms of the politics or the electoral processes. I think just now we do have one, a case in point, where the Foreign Affairs Ministry had to summon a representative of a foreign country who have somewhat meddled in these electoral processes. How far should they go?
A diplomat represents another country. We define a diplomat as an honorable spy. It's a spy that is in your country. So they have a right to a certain opinion, and they will aid. But also, as a country, we also have our own right in terms of our own sovereignty. That's also protected according to international law. So each diplomat knows their boundary according to diplomatic communities. They really know what they're supposed to do and where they are supposed to go. It is my hope that they will observe those diplomatic strictures. It's etiquette as well. As well. To just know their parameters. But in the event, most likely, some, for whatsoever reason, they feel like they need to go overbound. I think the government should just be there as well to remind them of.
But let's also look at the election monitor, the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission. What must it be doing from today going forward?
Well, it has got the mandatory duty to ensure that the election is held in accordance with the Constitution. And just to add to what Dr. Mataruse was saying, one of the international yardsticks for measuring the fairness of an election is transparency. And if you are open to observers, it means that your processes are fundamentally transparent. And so ZEC has got that obligation to ensure that the processes are transparent, that they are in line with the law, that they undertake voter education, that they supervise voter education that is undertaken by the civil society organizations, and basically to ensure that even the tallying and everything else complies with the law, and that they deliver what we have prescribed in the basic law, which is the Constitution of the Republic.
What are the timelines according to the Constitution in terms of when results of the 23rd of August elections must be published?
Well, the Constitution sets out specific time frames. I noticed from the last election that a day or two afterwards, people were getting impatient. But ZEC is up to 7 days to
publish the results.
To publish the results.
What role or what exactly should the electorate know in terms of their conduct as we get into this election period?
Thank you. I think the most important thing and the burden is actually on the political parties and the candidates themselves to disseminate information pertaining to the electoral conduct, which is expected of them and their supporters. So the important thing is that the candidates and political parties should familiarize themselves with the provisions of the Code of Conduct for political parties and candidates, and also disseminate that information to their supporters.
I think that's very important. I will still come back to issues of the violence that you have mentioned, and Dr. Mataruse, as a political analyst, in terms of the message that should now be going out, let's talk about the media. We're here as the state broadcaster, the independent media. What kind of messages should they be carrying in terms of urging people to remain peaceful and non-violent as we get into the elections?
I think one of the most important strategies would be to inform people about the processes, because if people are ignorant about what's happening, you make room for misinformation, disinformation, and fake news, which in the age of social media is really something. Someone can just type in their blankets, I'm thinking results are like this, or someone has just said this about the process. But if we continuously have a system where the process is communicated to people, and I think that's also a task for ZEC. I don't know how they can also do that to make sure people are made aware of the process and what's happening, not just only results, but even from the nomination court and the other processes that are happening, many, and why they should happen. The laws should be cited, and as much as possible, the representativeness, of whatever they'll be doing when they consult, especially when they consult various political parties. I think it's important to have that point made in the media as well, to make sure that the media reports on such, especially bipartisan or multi-partisan interactions. I think they're important to be reported on.
Now, perhaps as we draw close to the end of our discussion, we have had a lot of, we have witnessed a lot of, debate on social media, particularly during the time of the delimitation report, whether it was published late, submitted late to this office, from that office, and so forth. Can you maybe explain on what exactly was taking place and how legal that process was or still is pertaining to the proclamation that was made today?
Well, the delimitation was important for the purposes of fixing the boundaries of constituencies and wards that would be used for the purposes of the election. There is a set time period beyond which the boundaries would be the old boundaries if there is no delimitation.
Okay.
And the delimitation that took place, in my view, took place in accordance with the basic law of Zimbabwe. ZEC prepared the initial draft. It was presented to Parliament. Parliament sent its comments. His Excellency sent his comment. And then ZEC came up with the final delimitation. And the Constitution is very clear that the boundaries, as finally fixed by ZEC, are the boundaries that will then apply. And once there is then a proclamation of the boundaries, and that is done in accordance with the timeframes provided for in the Constitution, then those newly proclaimed boundaries will apply for the purposes of the election.
I think to add on to what Advocate has just mentioned, the Constitution provides that the boundaries have to be pronounced 6 months before polling date. And looking at the time frames, the new boundaries as set by ZEC will apply in this election.
So also seeing here that there's this general agreement that from the delimitation report, the voter inspection processes to leading to the proclamation, and the proclamation itself have all been a constitutional undertaking. Nothing so far done outside of the Constitution. Perhaps we can agree to that, gentlemen.
Well, that is my view, and there has been an attempt, by the way, to challenge the delimitation itself in the Constitutional Court, and that attempt has failed. And it basically means that absent a declaration by an appropriate court with the appropriate jurisdiction, what has been done in accordance with the law. And there is a presumption of validity in respect of all acts by administrative and public authorities. And that presumption of regularity can only be discharged by clear evidence before an appropriate court that shows that things were not done the way they should have been done.
I see.
Yes.
What could have been the outcome had this challenge to the delimitation report sailed through?
If the challenge had sailed through, then elections for this year would have been held on the basis of the 2008 delimitation. The old boundaries would have applied. Remember that if the delimitation does not take place at least 6 months prior to polling date, then the old boundaries apply.
Now, Dr. Mataruse, perhaps your last words to Zimbabweans as we come to the end of our discussion.
I think it's important to go out there and do what is your right. You know, it's a right to vote. I was just looking at the history of Zimbabwe, and I saw that amongst things that people were struggling for was the right to vote. I was looking in particular at the 1962 Constitution, where the Patriotic Front, then, you know, in Rhodesia, he had a different proposition about the right to vote. There were two voters' rolls, an A and a B. And I was just thinking at the changes that we have come from, since 1980. And I've also looked at the kind of, suffering and struggling that's been put generally around elections in the country. We cannot afford to be apathetic. When people participate and go whichever side they vote for, that participation is very vital and is very healthy for our democracy. We have to call it our democracy, by the way. We hardly refer to it as our democracy, yes, but it is our democracy. It is budding. It is growing, The United States, over 300 years of constructing a democracy. In the UK, the period is much longer, we have to call it a democracy. It's our democracy, and it is made the fundamental pillar of that democracy is the right to vote. And we have to make sure we exercise that right. If you missed your turn to register, or if you can't register in the last 2 days, I think next time it's important to make sure that we are involved. Generally, civic involvement. We must be participating in the solutions, in the finding of solutions for our country.
Yes, Joe, I could see you agreeing. Our democracy?
Yes, I do concur with what Doc has said. I would urge Zimbabweans to register to vote within the next 2 days which are left. And upon then, they can check their names on the voters' roll to see whether indeed they have been recorded as part of the electorate. Yes.
From a legal standpoint, what message do you have to Zimbabweans?
From a legal standpoint, I think I would reiterate my previous sentiments that Zimbabweans should go and register to vote within this time period, and upon then, they can inspect their voters' roll. It appears that the law anticipates that there can be discrepancies in the voters' roll. But after the voters' roll has been closed, there cannot be excuse why there are discrepancies in the voters' roll. So I would urge Zimbabweans once again to register to vote and then check their names on the voters' roll.
Your words to Zimbabweans?
Well, one of the fundamental pillars underpinning the protracted armed struggle that led to the independence of the Republic of Zimbabwe was the right to vote. And people fought for one man, one vote. The equality of all votes. My vote is not superior to yours. And together, we determine how we are going to be led and by whom we are going to be led. That means, therefore, that you expect different outcomes. And the outcome that I expect may not be the outcome that you expect. And the law is drawn in such a way that there can only be one winner. And so the message to Zimbabweans is basically to say that however way I voted, whatever my desires were, at the center of any functional democracy is the ability to accept the voice of the majority. And that is law.
Wow, you are saying that is law. Is it as easy as you are saying it, advocate? We have had elections a couple of times. But the issue of accepting results, this is something that is also going to determine the next phase. President Mnangagwa is actually anticipated, so to speak, by even legally declaring or pronouncing a date for a runoff. Because we normally have these issues cropping up at every election, disputes and so forth. Tell us what you think about the acceptance of results, of election results.
People are entitled to hold their views. People are entitled to exercise their constitutional rights, including the right to approach a court where one is aggrieved. But we must bear in mind that the duty, the mandatory exclusive duty to pronounce the winner is that of the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission. No person other than the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission can pronounce the winner. And once ZEC has pronounced the winner, subject to any view that the Constitutional Court may take in the event of a presidential election, ZEC's result stands. And once ZEC as the organ that we as the people entrusted with the mandate to deliver a free, fair, credible, transparent election, he has delivered that election. We have got an obligation in terms of our social contract derived through the Constitution to have them run that process. We should be able to say that regardless of how I feel, I might feel aggrieved. I might feel that certain things have not been done properly. But the constitutional measures that we as a people put in place to center our democracy have been done. And if they've been done, we should be able to begin to move forward and avoid this polarization that takes place in between elections. You cannot have a country perpetually in election mode, which is why the Constitution and the laws of Zimbabwe define an election period. After the election period, as a people, we must begin to move forward. As a people, we must begin to work together for the good of the motherland.
Thank you so much. Gentlemen, I want to say thank you so much to Dr. Prolific Simbarashe Matarusi, our political analyst, also to Joe Signoro, our legal expert, and Advocate Luis Uriri, our legal expert as well. I want to say thank you so much for coming to this discussion.
Thank you very much.
Well, viewers, there you have it. We are now in election mode, as has been espoused by our panel here today, as we were discussing the pronouncement made today, the 31st of May 2023, by President Emmerson Mnangagwa through a gazette that sets the 23rd of August 2023 as the date for the general elections. And the general view from the program is that it is a constitutional requirement for that proclamation to be made. It is within the Constitution, but it's also the obligation of every Zimbabwean to participate in the election, as well as for the election players, the political parties themselves, to play their role in terms of educating their supporters about what they must be doing this day going forward. 23rd of August 2023, Zimbabwe will be deciding on the next leadership for the next 5 years. My name is Justin Matlatla. Thank you so much for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your viewing.